Today's event will begin momentarily. Before we start, please note a few disclaimers outlined here, and as a reminder, this program is being recorded and will be available for replay on Cytokinetics' website. This is a general information webinar, free and open to the public. Cytokinetics is a corporate sponsor of the program. All speakers and panelists are speaking as individuals and should not be attributed to their employers, affiliations, or institutions. Nothing said in today's program should be deemed medical treatment or advice. Always speak with your healthcare professional about any medical matters. The program and any discussion will not discuss Cytokinetics' investigational drug candidates, clinical trials, or research, nor any other specific treatments or therapies. To open today's discussion, here's Dr. Mireya Mayor.
Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Mireya Mayor. I'm a National Geographic Explorer, and I am also the Director of Science Communications at Florida International University. For the last 2 decades, I have explored some of the most remote and unexplored regions around the world in search of little known and, in one case, undiscovered species of primate. My background is, of course, in primatology. And joining me today in this important and fascinating discussion about the parallels between exploration and pharmaceutical research and discovery is Robert Blum, President and Chief Executive Officer of Cytokinetics. Robert was named a Henry Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute in recognition of his leadership in corporate and civic responsibilities. Nice to see you again, Robert.
Very nice to see you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about what we're doing in the area.
Likewise, I'm excited. Well, before we begin, I just want to add for everyone watching that if you have any questions, ideas, and are interested in participating in the conversation, I'm going to be on Twitter during and after the program using the hashtag #FortitudeOnTheFrontier. So please join us there. So Robert, we have talked in the past about the parallels, the unseemingly likely parallels of exploration for me in the wilds, in the field, and medical research in the lab. And what we both agreed on was the amount of fortitude that it takes. So for me on expeditions, especially trying to make these new discoveries, it's all about pushing boundaries. I have a question for you, which is, what does it mean to push boundaries in medical research?
You know, it's a bit ironic and unexpected, isn't it, that we have some of these parallels between the work you do and the work associated with science and research around new medicines. But to push new boundaries means to aspire and to be inspired in ways that challenge the conventional wisdom associated with science and biology, and look perhaps where no one has looked before for what could be the promise of that science delivering on something that we would argue is bigger than ourselves. And in connection with pharmaceutical research, that speaks to the underlying passions and compassions that I think drug discovery scientists bring to their jobs every day.
How do we set bigger and bolder goals? And what have you found helps companies make these more ambitious plans?
I think it starts with a mission and a culture and aligned values. Maybe a little bit of naivete as well. Certainly an audacity that comes with asking questions that might not have been asked before. Ultimately, it comes down to people and their want to do something that extends to the service of others. And I think in connection with companies like ours, bringing together like-minded people who want to dedicate to the advancement of science for the purposes of medicine is non-trivial. But when you find those special people and you can join together with purpose, that's a very powerful thing.
I completely agree. And I think it does take a bold vision, a sense of wonder to ask those questions. But as you said, a bit of that naivety to stay the course, to never be jaded by the many challenges that arise as you're going down this path. And so I think one of the other topics that we touched upon in our previous conversation is that making these discoveries or the advances, it takes a lot of time, right? And it takes a lot of patience, and it takes that commitment to really stay the course when things either go wrong or they just don't go as planned. So basically, it would seem as if during the journey, there are all what seems like failures at the time, but you learn from those, and it's not this linear process, but it can still be incredibly discouraging. So what qualities do you look for when you're choosing members of your team?
And not unlike the work that you do, where there's a bit of meandering, I'm sure, that goes into every path on which you find yourselves and you journey, so too is that true in our world. To give you a bit of a background, our company was formed 25 years ago, and over the course of that time, we've maintained a certain North Star with regard to that which matters most. And it's about delivering on the promise of one area of biology, but for new medicines addressing patients' unmet needs. How we get there, however, matters. And to your question and point, we've had to build certain resolve, and with that comes a fortitude, along the way, a resilience. We ask questions. Sometimes we get the answers we're looking for. Other times it produces new observations that build on what can be the next hypothesis to be tested. It's never a straight line, but if you maintain your vision, your mission, your purpose, your values, you align together towards what ultimately will be those objectives. And in a company like ours, that's required of us to be resourceful, creative, innovative. We've had to be marshaling resources, both those that relate to science, but also financial, in order to be able to make happen our future. And you find out quickly who has the conviction to be in it for the right reasons and ultimately for the same aligned purpose. And as we have gathered those people together, that enables us to attract and retain and cultivate talent. And it's remarkable, it's frankly extraordinary to see how those types of lofty ambitions enable us to be empowered to be more and more resilient in our purpose.
I've never thought of a failed expedition because, as you mentioned, there's so many things that you learn along the way that only better prepare you for the next attempt at whatever that goal, that big vision is. And so I'm wondering for you, what resources do you need to prepare in order to sustain that research?
So in building a company, in order to be able to sustain the research, you have to be equipped to be both pioneering and leading. And therefore you need a certain discipline to know what you're good at and what you're not good at, and maintain that same focus. It's enabled us, because we're in the business of science, to be able to corral financial resources to do certain deals, with each one enabling of us access to further resources to advance our mission and science. And it's an elegant, beautiful thing when scientists and business professionals who are not scientists join together with one quest in mind. And I think we've demonstrated at Cytokinetics over the course of admittedly 25 years that when you maintain those same commitments and self-awareness, you're able to further science for the benefit of research as ultimately can serve patients. And that's afforded us opportunities to build a pipeline of investigational drug products at different stages of advancement, all together that enable us to mitigate the risk associated with this as a business endeavor and still trod forward to push towards boundaries that, not unlike I'm sure you experienced in the depths of an Amazon rainforest, associate with wins and victories along the way, each one a milestone towards something that is one step closer to delivering on the promise and benefit for patients.
Absolutely. And in both of these areas of research, we've established it takes a long time. It takes that patience. It also requires a lot of financing. So what do you think it takes to convince investors to stick with that longer term project?
So not every investor would be interested in the kinds of timelines and horizons that a company like ours might be focused towards, and that's okay, but many are. And aligning around those investors towards what is our ultimate objective was important. Over the course of 25 years, we've spent well over $1 billion towards ultimately what we hope will be new medicines for patients suffering from cardiovascular and other muscle-related diseases. And that takes a certain fortitude amongst investors as well. Thankfully, we've rewarded them along the way, and we've built a valuable company, but that's not been without some setbacks. 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. This morning, we announced the results of a clinical trial that didn't go our way, but that's been one setback along the way for what have been a number of other studies that have advanced the ball down the field towards what we believe will be not just a business that rewards shareholders, but more importantly, frankly, a business that advances science for the benefit of patients. And I think that's something everybody, all stakeholders, can align around.
And that type of fortitude does require a lot of motivation. And I know that for me, my biggest motivator as a scientist and as an explorer is the possibility of discovery, bringing to light something new that the world has never seen. So I'm curious, where do you find your motivation?
So it's absolutely what you just said. We find our motivation in the uncertainty associated with science and asking the key critical questions so as to be able to be advancing science for the benefit of humankind. And with that, nothing can motivate us more than when we meet patients who are so dependent on our success. They meet with us in our laboratories, and we meet them where they are. And we have been privileged to be able to serve their interest and needs. And when we discuss with them what are the limitations associated with their muscle-related diseases, it inspires our scientists to do that much more. It inspires all of our employees to make happen a brighter future for those patients and their caregivers who depend so much on our fortitude, our resilience, our perseverance, our persistence, and our successes.
And clearly you and your team are all incredibly committed. So I want to ask you, why is it so important to find new treatments for heart disease?
Because heart disease was an epidemic long before we even knew the word pandemic. And if you look at what are the aging demographics, baby boomers now over the age of 65. We're confronting a major epidemic in heart disease with morbidity and mortality that is off the charts. And it's only getting worse with the aging population. We bear a responsibility in our business and with our biology. And we're experts in one small area of biology, but it's incumbent upon us to translate that into new medicines for what represents new treatments to attack that epidemic. And as we'll be hearing, I think, from panelists in a moment, these are the people who are on the front lines confronting that every day.
So I've been on expeditions where we have run out of food. We've endured monsoons and tropical diseases, and picking the wrong team would have very likely ended in mutiny, right? So how do you create that culture of motivation and fortitude, and how do you motivate a team to keep going down that road that seems so long and where the goal seems so far away?
You know, it's illuminating when you meet those people, but you know them when you meet them. And people who are authentic to these values and mission and purpose, they stand out. And when you stand shoulder to shoulder with them, you're much more powerful as a team than any one of us individually. And it's not for everyone. And we recognize that. And I think we've been very fortunate at Cytokinetics to have not only a continuity of team, but a continuity of vision. And we sometimes refer to ourselves as the island of misfit toys, when you meet those people and they join you in that mission, it makes it even more powerful to be able to achieve that which is collectively good. And it, I think, continues to inspire us every day, again, to serve a mission and a purpose bigger than ourselves.
We touched upon the many obstacles, the challenges that present themselves in scientific research, that non-linear process of getting to the discovery. Leaders play an enormous role during these tough times. So what principles are you guided by when you're trying to navigate the team through those challenges?
You know, it's actually pretty simple. When you're genuine and sincere about why you do what you do, people will follow. And as a CEO, I think about my role more as is perhaps embodied in the servant leadership model. It's my job to help enable and empower our employees to do what they do best, to remove obstacles in their way, to be enabling of them by accessing resources, to be serving their abilities as ultimately we align together towards making new medicines happen for patients. And I believe that if you're authentic to those types of principles, then the rest falls into place pretty naturally.
Agreed. Could you give us an example of when you faced or overcame adversity?
It happens every day. It happened today. It happened today when we had to announce that a clinical trial that we embarked on over 5 years ago did not meet its objective. It was neutral to some of our interests. But that's in the totality a small setback compared to the 32 clinical trials we've conducted along the way that furthered our interest for what could be a potential new medicine. And that, together with all the other thousands and thousands of patients enrolled in our studies, and many, many, many studies over many years, is enabling of us to maintain our discipline and focus. And rallying everybody around those objectives is not difficult if everybody comes into the conversation with the same sorts of expectations. There will be positives, there will be setbacks, much like you've experienced, I know, in your expeditions. But if you're doing it again,
in some ways, they become motivators too, those setbacks, to push harder, to go further. And so many times the expectations of others are to go farther, but they want you to go faster. And so they want to see those big results right away. So how can you demonstrate the importance of those small steps?
So nobody will ever accuse us of being an overnight success. We've been doing this for 25 years, many of us working together. But at the same time, all you need to do is meet one of these patients and you feel a profound urgency that there's more we should be doing faster. One doesn't need to be reminded.
Well, I think the message here is reach farther and stay there longer, because it really takes a long-term commitment to stay the course. I'm now going to hand over the reins to Michelle Cortez. She's the health editor at Bloomberg News, for what I think is going to be a really great conversation with some of the world's foremost experts in heart failure. Again, just as a reminder, if you have any questions, ideas, and you're interested in participating in the conversation, I'm going to be on Twitter during and after the program using the hashtag Fortitude on the Frontiers. So Michelle, over to you. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was so interesting listening to that conversation, and really what a great time to actually be having this conversation, because this is exactly what we're talking about here. You know, fortitude on the frontier. Certainly heart failure is a frontier. We really need more medicines for this, more treatments for this situation. And I'm very excited about this panel that we've gathered here today to talk about heart failure. Now, of course, it is a segment of cardiovascular disease, which is the leading cause of death in the United States and around the world. Heart failure is a particularly difficult type to treat. We don't have enough medicines for this. We don't have enough medical devices. We don't have enough options for these patients. And it costs over $30 billion a year in costs of lost productivity and actual medical care. So we really need to have some advances here. The panel that we brought together is an expert panel. They can really cover the waterfront when it comes to heart failure. And I'm very excited to have them all with us. Now, I'm going to let you refer to the invitation for their specific titles because they're impressive and extensive. But I will just do a brief introduction for each one of the panelists here. So we have Dr. Robert Harrington, who is an interventional cardiologist. That means that he works with medical devices to do procedures to help treat patients with heart failure. He is also the chair of medicine at Stanford University and a former president of the American Heart Association. We have Dr. Eldrin Lewis, who is a clinician scientist. He is an expert in severe heart failure, and he's the chief of cardiovascular medicine at Stanford University. And he's also an expert when it comes to quality of care. That's particularly important when we're talking about heart failure. We have Dr. James Spudich. He is a basic researcher. He does fundamental research, and he is an expert in the actual molecular level of what's going on in heart failure. Specifically, he works with contractile proteins that tell us what is going wrong or what is happening with the heart muscle that powers the entire heart. He is a professor of biochemistry and cardiovascular medicine at Stanford University, and he has co-founded 3 companies working to get treatments for human health on the market, including Cytokinetics, which is one of our sponsors here. And we also have Dr. Fady Malik. He is the executive vice president of research and development at Cytokinetics. He is a trained interventional cardiologist. He's also a clinical professor at UCSF. So thank all of you for being with us here today. And I am going to pass it over to Dr. Lewis to give us just an overview. Now, he is somebody who works with patients across the board here. He knows everything that happens with these people. He deals with them every single day. So if you could walk us through, set the stage with heart failure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I'll just talk a little bit briefly. As many of you know, that 6.2 million people is a daunting number, but it really doesn't tell the story. Because the story really is a tale of two different types of patients. You have the patients who have early stage stable heart failure, who actually can still have a reasonable quality of life and kind of live their life and do the things that they want to do and really still be a person. And then you have the patients who are really at the end stages of their disease with advanced heart failure. And what we often are looking for are strategies that will help identify patients at an early stage and prevent progression of disease. Because once they've reached kind of the advanced stages, which usually represents about 400,000 or so patients with stage D cardiomyopathy, those patients have very limited options. It's heart transplant, which includes we do quite a few, but despite that being a really life-changing therapy, it's a therapy that is really reserved for about 4,000 patients because of limited donor availability. So that's a drop in the bucket from an epidemiologic perspective. And then mechanical circulatory support devices. These, once again, really dramatically change the type of life that patients live. And so for the majority of patients with these advanced stages, they unfortunately have a limited life expectancy. So there are a lot of advances which we'll go into that have actually changed the natural history. But in terms of how we take care of patients, it's really important that we look at all of the 6.2 million people. And one of the things that has kind of resonated with me, especially over the last few years, is just how inequitable sometimes the care has been, and also the disparities that we see in who progresses and who doesn't. So we need to better understand what we can do, the mechanisms, and then also identify how to, once again, prevent the progression of disease and enable excellent quality of life for everyone.
Thanks so much for that. I appreciate it. I'm wondering now if we can move to Dr. Harrington. Now, we've had a huge amount of progress when it comes to treating cardiovascular disease. It is the most, the number one cause of death, obviously, but also it is the most profitable area of treatment when it comes to almost to any type of disease in the world. So of course, that is where some of this interest comes from. This is, where we get more progress when you can see that you're making a difference, not only for patients, but you actually have the money to do the research as well. So Dr. Harrington, I'm wondering if you can walk us through where we are in terms of treating heart failure, why we haven't had the type of success against heart failure that we have seen with cardiovascular disease, which I know you've worked in both of these areas.
Well, I could give you the brief answer, which is that it's hard, and that, our understanding of biology, which Dr. Sputich can talk about more eloquently than I, has not always translated into direct patient care benefits. And what we know, and I think you've indicated it nicely, is if you go back to the 50s, 60s, and then track our progress against cardiovascular disease, our public health benefits of blood pressure control and weight loss and exercise and cessation of smoking have all made huge impacts in the outcome of patients with cardiovascular disease. And then the introductions of a series of medicines, including medicines for heart failure, have made added benefits. Eldrin's mentioned some of the procedural advantages. In my own field and Fatty's field, things like coronary stenting and angioplasty when you're having a heart attack have made huge advances in the care of patients. But we've hit a bit of a blockade. And if you look now to about 2015, 2016, we're seeing a plateauing of patient improvement in the setting of cardiovascular disease, meaning that the mortality decline we'd seen for decades has stopped. In some populations, that decline is even reversing itself. And I think we're at an area where we need more insights from the biology. Again, Dr. Sputich and Dr. Malik can help us with that, where we can really get at the essence of what these diseases are and how we might interfere with them. Eldrin has mentioned we need a big refocused attention on health equity and trying to understand why some groups are not doing as well as others. And we need to double down our public health efforts on making sure that blood pressure control is widely available, that it's widely implemented, So understanding the biology, dealing with some of the public health issues, and new medicines which should emerge from the science are all things we've got to do.
Right, yeah, and to your point, Dr. Spudich, we have one of the foremost authorities here on this actual topic to talk about the basic research and the basic understanding when it comes to heart failure. Now, that's something that I've heard over and over again, that this is one of these areas that we don't fully understand yet, much like the Alzheimer's disease, other types of conditions, and we need more basic research to actually hone in on what's going on with heart failure. So Dr. Spudich, I'm wondering if we can pass it over to you to tell us what is it that we know and why is it that heart failure at this molecular level is so difficult, and what do we need to know in order to make some progress going forward? Oh no, it sounds like maybe we don't have Dr. Spudich.
Looks like I have to unmute. Okay, there I am. Thanks for the invitation to be on this panel. The heart is probably much better understood than a lot of other organs in the body, certainly than the brain. And you mentioned Alzheimer's and so on. It's a highly sophisticated pump, and it's amazing what's known about it. But as has already been mentioned, there's an awful lot that's not known. Most, if not all, of the medications that are currently used in one way or another are designed to affect calcium levels in the heart, for example. And we've all thought for many years now that we understood the molecular basis of that calcium response as being regulating one of the two filaments, those two filaments being the fundamental elements that cause the heart to contract. But it turns out in just recent year or so, a lot of data I know that isn't even published yet, that it's becoming clear that calcium actually affects not that filament only, but probably the other filament as well. And so that's an area that's profound, that we have to understand that. And if we don't understand that, we really are missing a large portion of the molecular understanding of the regulation. So we really need constantly to be doing more and more basic research on basic biochemistry and biophysics of the molecules involved. It's amazing what we know about them. Probably the very best studied proteins of all proteins in the cell, but amazingly, there's still so much to learn. And so I see two challenges going forward. One is the challenge of maintaining not only money coming into biotech to drive the biotech engine, but the money coming into academic labs to drive the basic research, a lot of which, as I'm indicating, still needs to be done. The second challenge is, which has always been there, how do you get that understanding from the academic labs translated into the biotech world? And it's a very slow process. So I think there's a real need to try to figure out new mechanisms to increase the ability to make that translation. And I know of some efforts at Stanford for sure, where that is being done right now, and it's much needed.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. To your point, to all of your points, that we do know so much about the heart. These proteins are well studied, and yet we're still learning more every single day. So it's important to translate what we do know and to actually pick the right targets, to pick the right clinical trials, to actually get to the next stage. So Dr. Malik, maybe you can come in here and talk to us about, when you're working in an area where there is so much that still needs to be done, where we've had so many challenges in getting products to the market, how is it that you pick what it is that you're going to go forward with, and how challenging is it to actually hone in on an area, heart disease, where we have had so many setbacks up to this point?
It's a tough problem. You have to be a really good student of the science, science that is done by people like Jim and others in the field. You have to form solid therapeutic hypotheses that drive programs that may be used to develop new medicines. And then you have to pursue them in a way that, hopefully comes up with a clear answer. And not every hypothesis is going to pan out. That's pretty well, I think, published in our, we have to get better, if you will, at translating basic research into positive outcomes. And as Dr. Harrington pointed out before, even the best hypotheses will sometimes go down in flames for reasons that aren't totally clear. But I think you have to persevere, and that was, I think, some of the messages that were brought over by the prior panel, prior discussion. You have to be able to continue to work deliberately in order to advance the field, and ultimately every small success built one on top of the other leads to, in aggregate, a tremendous change in the quality of patients' lives. And I think, when you look at the progress we've made over the last 2, 3, 4 decades, the outcomes in these patients are tremendously better, but they obviously are still not as good as we'd like them to be.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the progress that we have made to this point has come from the progress with cardiovascular medicine, right? A lot of patients are being kept alive longer who previously might have passed away. And that's giving them time to develop heart failure. There's lasting damage to the heart that we need to address going forward. Now, I'm hoping maybe we can open it up a little bit here. From my perspective, I've been writing about this particular area for the last 25 years. And it seems to me that there's basically 4 buckets of challenges when it comes to coming up with new treatments for any condition, right? Also, a quick throw in here, if anyone wants to tweet at us for this, hashtag Fortitudes on the Frontiers. If you have a question that we want to ask, please tweet to us, or you can put it right into the chat here on our Zoom. We want to hear from you because we're going to be doing Q&A, and we're interested in your thoughts on questions on this topic. But I'm wondering if we can go back, maybe Dr. Harrington, if you can start with us and tell me, I know that you actually have worked on research across the board. How is it that you decide where you want to go forward, and what do you see at this point is the biggest challenge for innovation in this area? Is it the 4 areas that I was saying: science, actually understanding the basics of what's happening and knowing what the target that you're going for; the money, actually getting investors and others to commit their time and their finances to getting these products to the market. Then there's the R&D process. Even when you have the understanding, even when you have the right molecule, sometimes if your trials aren't designed correctly, or if you just have bad timing, or things, as Dr. Malik pointed out, you have no idea why it goes a little bit off the rails. The 4th bucket being the regulatory issue that would include guidelines and marketing. So Dr. Harrington, I guess we can start with you, and then we'll open it up to the panel. What do you think is the biggest challenge here when it comes to developing new treatments for heart failure?
All of it. And I don't mean to be snide, and I don't mean to make light of it, but I think you've nicely encapsulated the obstacles along the way. I mean, like Eldrin, like Fadi, I'm a clinician, and I think that the best hypotheses emerge from clinical observations where you say, why isn't this person doing well? Or why did this group of patients die early? What are we missing? And then it's talking with people like us that people like Jim Sputich say, oh, that's an interesting problem. I wonder if what I do might lend some insights. And then, as Fadi said, when we take what Jim has discovered and we begin to form a hypothesis, well, if we did this, would that be better than what we're already doing? And then we have to design clinical studies that allow us to, do the A versus B test. Is what we're hypothesizing, is that better than what we already do? And then we have to design studies that actually mimic or are a replica, if you will, of the clinical setting, and all of the messiness that occurs in the clinical setting, including comorbidities and other medications and all the other stuff that happens to people. And you have to design a good study with good data collection, good analytic plans. And so it's all of it that's difficult. And then even when you get a positive result, you still have to go the additional gauntlet of, can we get this therapy, whether it's a drug, a device, a biologic, can we get this device into the hands of the clinicians who might be treating the patients? And that requires going down the regulatory pathway, which is fraught with its own challenges. So every part of the process is difficult. Every part of the process costs a lot of investment, and you need big teams, each part along the way. And that all emerges from the clinician saying at the bedside, why does this happen? Why can't we do better?
Dr. Malik, do you think that you have, or I'm sorry, Dr. Lewis, go ahead, please jump in.
Oh, no, I was just going to add, I'm so sorry. I would just add to exactly what Dr. Harrington said is, the landscape has gotten crowded in heart failure, and that's a good thing. So if we go back to 1986, when we saw the first positive trial with VHEFT1, or look at 1987 with consensus, in the class 4 heart failure patients, 1 year, you had a mortality rate in the placebo arm of almost 50%, over 50%. It was a lethal disease. We can get lulled into a sense of complacency saying we've come a long way, and we have, but it's still a lethal disease that's worse than most cancers. So now we have 4 pillars for heart failure management, and it's hard to, because of equipoise, it's hard to kind of say, let's take away one of those pillars and then let's add a 5th drug or a 6th drug. And so you're adding on. And so as a consequence, what happens is, even when we have those wins, which we're seeing, those wins come on top of an already much better baseline where the mortality rate has gone down. And so the magnitude or the effect size will be smaller. And so what Dr. Harrington suggested of how we take the science and translate it into getting it into people's hands and prescribing it becomes important as well. So it does take a lot. And in fact, some of the trials will not have a comparison against placebo, but in fact, comparison against a direct comparator, because it's really challenging. So as we continue to try to investigate this, we have to look at the niches of patients that remain at high risk, and then also try to understand, where do we add on and where do we substitute?
Yeah, that's a great point. And the idea that heart failure has a higher mortality rate than many cancers is so important for people to understand. I mean, that speaks to why there's so much urgency to actually getting some innovation and improving survival and outcomes when it comes to heart failure. Dr. Malik, how do you feel about, Dr. Eldren's point here that there are many compounds that are available, that are being developed? Do you think that there's an embarrassment or an abundance of riches? How do you know which path to go down? And when you've had hiccups, as Cytokinetics has announced today, going forward, how do you stick with that? How do you know when to let go?
Well, I think we do have a number of therapies today, but it's really a question of how do you measure success? And if we're going to measure success with the fact that patients on best medical therapy who've been hospitalized with heart failure in the last 6 months or so have a 50% chance of going back into the hospital and a 10 to 12% chance of dying in the coming year, that's not my measure of success. That tells me we still have a long ways to go. And as Dr. Lewis said, it used to be much worse, but so relatively, it looks like we made a lot of progress, which we have, but I wouldn't say we've succeeded even with the therapies we have. One of the challenges is going to be to understand, how do you implement new therapies? How do you decide when to retire old therapies? And how do you advance the field? And that's going to be a challenge we have to solve. And I also think we have to the field of medicine is so different than many other areas where we're used to seeing, yearly innovations and progress. I mean, you get a new phone every year with some new gizmo in it, and the pace of technology is much different than the pace of medical innovation. And some of these medicines that we've talked about, literally from concept through to availability to the patient, have taken longer to develop than it took me to raise my daughter and graduate her from college. So we have to continue to press forward. It's a cumulative, medicine has changed a lot. I don't consider myself that old. I guess I probably should start putting myself in that category. But when I think about how we've progressed in medicine from the time that I started practicing, HIV was an epidemic, heart disease, we had very few options in order with which to treat heart failure. You turn to the page to where we are now, which is a couple, 2.5 decades later. And with the emergence of a pandemic 2 years ago, within 2 years, we have multiple therapeutic approaches, we have vaccines. The pace of innovation has grown, but not equally in all areas. And the prevalence of heart disease in our society is so high. It's incumbent on us to keep pushing forward, even as the pace of innovation may not be as high as it is in other areas.
I would say on an optimistic note, there's so much going on that I'm aware of at the basic research side, which is kind of the starting point of the whole cascade of things that you asked about. And I completely agree that all of those are equally important and everything needs to be pulled together. But it all starts with the basic research side. And I'm aware of so much new work going on that I feel pretty confident that in the next few years, we're already going to have some new detailed understandings at the real fundamental level of how these contractile proteins are really functioning. That will open up new doors for yet new innovative new drug therapies. So I'm totally optimistic about that. That doesn't solve all the other problems that we've been talking about, but I think that there is the potential of a new constant influx of new ideas, new things to try.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it that having additional targets is incredibly important, but also when it comes to drug and device development, knowing when to let go of certain things is also critically an issue, because there is a limited amount of money when it comes to trying to decide what you're going to develop. So I can't imagine how difficult it is when you are the person who's trying to pick what compound to go forward with, what device to go forward with, how to stick with that, with which ones of those there are. Dr. Lewis, I'm wondering if we can come back to you to talk about specifically what area of heart failure you see that we need to have the most, where we need to have the most innovation. Do you think that if we can get to it earlier, if we can offer people treatments that will slow the progression of the disease, that's going to have the most impact? I know that you're an expert when it comes to the patients with the most severe disease. How do we help them? How do you talk about these patients? And I'm wondering if you can tell us what you're seeing on the ground. Do we have a crisis here? Is there an epidemic of heart failure? How do you talk with these patients?
Absolutely. So I think there are a couple of major areas where we can make significant progress. I think it starts with prevention. So all of the things that have been mentioned before, controlling hypertension, understanding people with hypertension, managing and treating coronary artery disease aggressively, as we've done, and better understanding who remains at risk for developing heart failure. It's amazing that 50% of patients with heart failure have coronary artery disease, but yet when patients survive an MI, or they undergo a myocardial infarction, or if they basically undergo a percutaneous coronary intervention, many times they don't understand that they're at a higher risk for heart failure development. All of the people with metabolic syndrome and diabetes, they're at significant risk. It's one of the biggest drivers of heart failure, but yet if you were to ask 100 patients, do you think you're at risk for heart failure? The answer would be no for the majority. So I think we need to do a lot better job at primary prevention and some secondary prevention post-MI. I think the primordial prevention is something that we all need to do to try to kind of go way back to childhood and try to prevent the risk factors from ever developing in the first place. In terms of the second area of need, it's actually to improve quality of life. And of course, I may be biased because that's my area of research, but if you ask patients, they're driven by how they feel. So death is binary. It happens and it'll happen for all of us. But we're not looking at the destination of life. We're looking at how we live the life. And we all need to work at that. So I think when we look at novel interventions, we should look specifically at patient-reported outcomes. How does it impact how they feel, their ability to do their work and to do their play and to interact with their family, and to improve their exercise capacity. When we do focus groups, patients with heart failure will tell you, I don't care about a score. I don't care about all of these things that we're concerned about. Reducing heart failure hospitalizations. A patient told me once, if he could be hospitalized once a year or twice a year, but can have a great life in between those hospitalizations, he'll take that exchange every day. But what he cares about is, can he play 18 holes of golf? Can he play with his grandchildren? And these are the things that I think are, it's a ripe area for us to develop for novel therapeutics. I think the third is to actually really focus on regeneration. I think stem cells, people have been working on stem cells for decades. And I think that's, kind of looking at the cellular mechanism, the structural mechanism of heart failure, understanding why some people remodel or their hearts get larger and then all of a sudden become dysfunctional, and why some people don't. How to have cardioprotective agents in the setting of cancer treatment so that when we can cure cancer, that it doesn't come at a cost of heart failure. And better understand how to use these pluripotent stem cells, how to use CRISPR technology to try to actually regenerate the heart. Because if that's the case, then I could see a time where we can actually use mechanical circulatory support devices, not as a destination or as a bridge to transplant, but as a bridge to recovery. So you take these advanced stages of heart failure and then do this. And I think the last thing I would say is, once patients get to end stage of disease, it becomes all or none. The decision becomes, are you a transplant candidate, yes or no? Are you a VAD candidate, yes or no? If not, are you ready for palliative care and hospice? And I think that group is the group that we have very few therapies. So if we were to look to where we can develop therapies, looking at xenotransplant, that would be great. Understanding how to turn off the antigens that are on a pig's heart, for instance, and try to allow for a designer heart for patients with heart failure, but also coming up with therapies that improve quality of life that may not actually improve survival. And the FDA and the regulatory agents have to be on board with that. But we have to be able to identify the patients who say, I prefer to live better than to live longer, and then provide therapies specifically targeting that patient population.
I just want to underscore what you just said there, which I think is something that everybody in this field needs to hear again. And that is knowing what it is that the patients value. That idea that maybe mortality isn't the end all be all. In some situations, it is the quality of life, or perhaps it's some other metric that we don't know exactly yet. So really critically important to listen to the patients here and to develop what it is that's going to make their lives better. Dr. Harrington, I wonder if you want to weigh in here on what you think when you're talking, or when you were talking with heart patients, in terms of where you think that we need the innovation most.
Well, Eldrin said it so nicely, which is, what do the patients care about? And in the less than a decade, there's been this massive change in how we do clinical trials. 15, 20 years ago, the clinicians sort of decided what was important and what were we going to measure, and let's go out and do the clinical trial. Today, to Eldrin's point, patients sit on these steering committees with us, and we have discussions with patients as to, what do you think? What is important, and how do we quantify that in a way that that we can measure that there's an effect on that? For some people, it's staying out of the hospital, as Fatty has mentioned. For others, as Eldrin says, they want to play a round of golf. They want to be able to pick up their grandchild. And I think what the big issue and the big innovations are is how do we create instruments and measurement tools so that we can actually study that in the course of clinical investigation to get at the essence of what's important to patients. Yes, we want to know things like, do you have a hospitalization? Yes, does it increase your risk of dying or shorten your longevity? Those are important endpoints to understand in clinical trials, but really getting at this essence of how do people feel? How do they live their life? How do they work? How do they engage with their families? Critically important. And I think where a lot of the innovation is going to come is through the use of technologies. Technology is going to help us do the research by being able to say, hey, I wear this thing 24/7. Can it provide some insight into, forget the who cares if you can walk for 6 minutes? How about how much did I walk all week? Did that get better? How much could I, how much faster is my gait now that I'm taking new medicines? These are important advances. And we, the research community, have to be able to figure this out. How do we provide patients medications, devices, strategies that are going to make them not just live longer, but it's going to make them feel better and avoid unpleasant things like going to the hospital?
So that's another layer of complexity when it comes to actually doing things like developing products and conducting clinical trials. We have a question from the audience about how can patients and researchers collaborate to make this, to accelerate the development of new therapeutics. And of course, that has to come with the companies, the people who are on the ground designing the clinical trials, determining how they're going to actually measure success. Dr. Malik, could you talk to us about, how you do involve patients in this process, and does it make it much more complicated, but help you get to where you want to be?
Well, I think as Bob said, this is a process that's, in development as well. We've begun to involve patients in the design of clinical trials. And in particular, what we often do is put together a patient panel and present them a clinical trial that we're planning to do. It's not only just about, what should we measure? It's how are we doing this? Is this how's this going to be inconvenient for your life? And how can we design this maybe a little better so that it facilitates yours and others' participation in the clinical trial? And we often get some, very good advice. I think where we have work to do is trying to reduce, the input that we get from patients into things we can measure, which Dr. Harrington alluded to. It's one thing, as Dr. Lewis said, measure how do you feel better, and we have tools that do that, but they're not as black and white as measuring whether someone's alive and dead. And how can we improve the precision, the sensitivity, the specificity of those tools? That's where, getting patient input and continuing to refine and improve those tools can help us get to ensuring clinical trials measure things that patients find important. We want to also involve patients in the conduct of the trial. So, just alongside of us, they can see how things are progressing, what kinds of challenges we have. Ultimately, it's a bit about developing a cadre of patient advocates, if you will, patients who are interested in clinical research, just as we have medical scientists interested in clinical research, who become expert at it and can participate and contribute to the process. So at least from my point of view, that's how we're trying to move this forward. I certainly don't think we've gotten to where we need to be, though.
So I'm going to change our focus here just a little bit and bring in the topic that has been consuming many of us for the past 2 years. That's, of course, the coronavirus pandemic that, I'm speaking to you here from Hong Kong. We're still right in the middle of it. But one of the things that is most concerning about the long-term ramifications of the pandemic is the impact that it's going to have on people's health long-term. Specifically, we're seeing it not only with long COVID, but when it comes to cardiovascular disease. We have seen a lot of studies that have suggested, particularly when it comes to heart failure. There's a study out of Nature Medicine that showed that there was actually an increased risk of heart failure. That was the biggest burden over the 12 months after people recovered from COVID, even if they weren't severely ill. Another piece of research that was really interesting to me is what the virus actually is doing in the body itself. We're seeing the impact that it's having on the muscle cells in the heart itself. So I'm going to just switch it up. Dr. Spudich, I don't know if you've been looking at this area at all, but basically, based on what you know, where your area of expertise is, I'm wondering if you can tell us any insights that you might have had on the implication of the virus on the heart itself.
Wow, I'm probably the least qualified to answer that question on your panel. So I may have to just deflect it because as far as I can understand it, there's really no obvious connection, but my panelists might know of something that I don't know.
Well, maybe I'll jump in, Michelle, that I think Jim's point is we don't know exactly why these observations are being made, but if you go back to the very beginning of the pandemic, we saw that there were people at risk for the infection who had cardiac comorbidities. They had had hypertension, they had had heart failure, they had had diabetes, and they seemed to be getting infected at a rate that was higher than others. There was a lot of early concern that maybe some of the medicines, particularly the ACE inhibitors, were problematic in allowing entry of the virus into cells and hastening the onset of infection. Intense investigation really rapidly shown that that was not the case. Then we went through this period of time where, you remember, we were all who were working in hospitals were afraid that we're all going to get infected. We didn't know how much PPE you needed. We didn't know what kind of masks you had to wear. And so people stayed away from hospitals. The American Heart Association, we launched a campaign called Don't Die of Doubt. Don't stay home and have your heart attack. Don't stay home with your worsening heart failure. Go to the hospitals. They're going to be a safe place. And I think as we began to work through all of that, then we start seeing, oh, the heart does get involved in this, that we had myocarditis. Aldrin could talk about this, that there was inflammation in the heart. Well, how common was that? And then we had vaccines and, oh, wait, some people who get the vaccine get myocarditis. Not very many of them, and certainly far less of them than if you get infected. But what does that mean? And then this paper, as you said, comes out in Nature Medicine. And I think it brings together all of it, Michelle. It's like, are these people who stayed at home, who, suffered the consequences of improperly treated or inadequately treated cardiac event? Are these patients who couldn't get out and get their medications because of other social, economic issues? Are these patients who had some direct effect of the disease? And I don't think we've teased all of that out. It's a really ripe area for study, and it will be. But that Nature Medicine article was sobering in terms of the potential burden of cardiovascular disease in the community. But Eldrin, what do you think? You and I have talked a lot about the myocarditis space in particular.
No, I totally agree with everything that you're saying. I think it's just we don't really know for certain. Depending on how you draw the line for myocarditis or inflammation, you can see numbers reported as high as 67% have some degree of inflammation on a cardiac MRI, down to much lower. And I think the truth is in the middle somewhere. I think if you have a threshold that says you have some imaging evidence and you have troponin elevation, that number goes much, much lower. But it is an issue. And it's an issue with long COVID syndrome for people who have ongoing heart rate insensitivities to exercise. And I think all of these are concerning. My biggest concern is actually the long-term effects, because the virus hasn't been known about long enough for us to know whether or not that this could be a cytopathic trigger that can actually cause some remodeling that happens and inflammation that happens. For a long time, people who kind of show up, and we call it idiopathic cardiomyopathy, and we'll say, have you had a recent infection? And they'll say, no, well, I had a really bad infection 6 months ago. And then they kind of show up with shortness of breath in the hospital with a dilated cardiomyopathy. So we don't really understand that. And I think over the next year or two, we'll understand whether or not there's a long-term kind of risk. And if there is, then that's a whole nother avenue for trying to prevent progression. For people who have documented COVID, do we need to be aggressive in monitoring? Is it worth kind of checking biomarkers like internal proBNP? These are things that we just don't know. But the best thing is really to stay healthy, right? Because the one thing that the COVID pandemic has shown us is that if the healthier you are, in general, the better you do, even though there's no guarantee, right? We've seen completely healthy young people who all of a sudden develop kind of fulminant myocarditis and struggle and need transplants and so forth. But the second thing that I would just emphasize, I know I sound like a broken record, but the other thing that COVID has actually shown us is how inequitable care can be sometimes. And so getting access to the monoclonal antibody, to antivirals, to being treated, if necessary, for the right patient becomes important. It can be a difference between kind of adverse events and not. And we don't know if it has long-term implications.
So everything you just heard is an indication that there's clearly a connection. But from the basic science point of view, I don't think anybody has a clue what's going on. Clearly, the immune system, which has been studied in great depth for a long time now, is so complicated. And there is something about inflammatory processes that do then affect other organs. But if you're asking me as a basic biochemist, biophysicist, what's going on, I don't know.
Well, I might also add, that what COVID has done in some ways is shine a real spotlight on problems that we had that existed even before COVID. The viral infections of the heart happened long before COVID. They were the most common cause of sudden death in young people, or unrecognized viral infections of the heart. What you have in COVID now is and so there was not very much attention paid to it because it wasn't that common. Now what you have in COVID is an unprecedented number of people who've been infected with the same virus that has some tropism for the heart and can cause heart damage as well. And so you see a much greater spotlight on it because of the number of cases that have emerged given the background infection rate. The inequities in healthcare delivery amplified again because COVID stresses the system in ways that we've never had to stress the system stressed before. And so I guess what I would say is that we're learning a lot from this pandemic about where weaknesses exist both in healthcare delivery, but also in our basic understanding of how the human body works. And hopefully we can learn from that and eventually, take advantage of it.
Great point. A number of you have touched on it here, this idea, this understanding that there has been discrepancy in our system for a very long time, and not always are people getting the treatment that they want based on their own backgrounds, that type of thing. Now, we've seen time and time again that we do need to have a wide breadth of information. So I'd like to explore this for a little bit. So Dr. Malik, let's start with you since you just answered the last question. What is it that you're doing at Cytokinetics? What is it that companies can do to make sure that they are including all the patients that they need in their clinical trials and getting the results across the board and making sure that the products that they eventually do bring to market are reaching the patients that most need them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging, always a challenge in some ways. You have a an obligation to try to enroll as diverse a population as you can, a population that's representative of the places where eventually you may be able to get your drug approved and get it to the patients in those countries. In part, remember this is a global endeavor we're in. In part, that means going to various different countries where different patterns of diversity exist. But also means in our own country, going to different parts of our own country where, different patterns of diversity exist so that you can provide access to your clinical trial for a broader patient population. And so, that means being in the South, being in the Northeast, being in the West, being in the middle of the country, ensuring you get to centers that treat and see a range of patients that allow you to enroll a diverse population. And it's also, speaks to the investigators as well. You want a group of investigators that also represents the population of people, women and men, and different ethnicities and races and so forth. And so, again, I think it's something that you have to consciously work towards. I don't think any of us have, found the perfect formula yet, but if you ignore it, you certainly won't ever get there.
Dr. Lewis, I wonder if you can talk to us about the challenges of some of these discrepancies as well. We know that that Black heart failure patients often have worse outcomes than others. Many times we aren't able to bring them into the system in the rates that we need. Wonder if you can weigh in on that a little bit as well. And then we'll go to Dr. Harrington about efforts that he's been involved with in terms of reaching out to all the relevant groups.
Absolutely, thank you. I think there are a couple of points that I would make. I think the first one is that, as many of you have heard, your zip code is more important than your genetic code in regards to longevity and outcomes, and that's something that we just need to change, because that comes down to not race but social determinants of health access, and I think that's something that we can change. There are efforts that are ongoing to try to better understand not only the efficacy of interventions, but the safety of interventions. And I think that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons that diversity in clinical trials becomes important. If you think about kind of VHF1 and VHF2, and I would be the first to admit that it was in a VA population, but the fact is these are pivotal studies in heart failure, and they enroll 0 females. Not a single female enrolled in those studies. So we need to understand that if we don't have diversity, both for sex-based diversity and race and ethnicity diversity, then we don't have a chance to uncover some of the side effect profiles that we would see. We wouldn't have seen the increased risk of angioedema among self-described Black patients. And this actually can affect the uptake, right? Because it becomes an urban myth. Oh, you can't take ACE inhibitors if you're Black. That's not the case. Of course, we want to make sure that the therapies that we develop are for everyone, and we understand the impact in different patient populations. The last thing I would say is kind of affordability. And this is something that we rarely talk about, but the affordability for the patient becomes really important. And it's not just the cost of the medicine, but it's the out-of-pocket cost. And actually what it takes in order to get that medication or that intervention prescribed. For instance, I grew up in Mississippi, and we have an incredible structural heart team here at Stanford, and do very complex cases for mitral valves and aortic valves and so forth. But if I happen to live in Mississippi or in a rural part of the country, without going somewhere, you may not have access to that care, and that could be the difference. Progression of disease. It's amazing how many people don't know that there's a percutaneous intervention for their aortic stenosis, and frankly, don't know that they have aortic stenosis. They just know they're short of breath. So I think as we try to understand these disparities and the inequities, we have to think of broadly beyond kind of race and ethnicity, but think about the sex differences, also think about where you are, and kind of make sure that we meet patients where they are and we provide the care that they need.
It would be hard to improve upon what Eldrin and Fadi just sketched out, but I'll say maybe three broad interlocking points here. The first is that, as Fadi has pointed out, that the pandemic has uncovered a lot of really bad things in our system, our society. And one of them is this real artificial separation between public health and clinical medicine. And that's something that both Eldrin and Fadi are getting at. And we've got to bring them back together. Good public health is good for clinical medicine, and the social determinants of health. Where you live in your neighborhood. Do you have safe sidewalks to walk on? Do you live in a food desert? Can you get to a drugstore to get your medication, to get your blood pressure pill counseling? The rural urban divide. All of those are critical questions that really are not. They're problems of the clinical system, although they're thought of as public health issues. We need to bring those two things back together. The second is that we need to improve the pipeline of people who are doing clinical medicine and public health. We need it, as Fadi said, to look more like the diversity that exists in America. I mean, we are a very diverse society. That's what clinical medicine needs to look like, and it doesn't. And then that really relates to the third point, which is that we have got to do a better job of researching in populations that we ultimately want to prescribe to. It really does need to look like the population of people with the disease. And part of that's going to be facilitated by the first two. We have to have a pipeline of investigators that looks like the patients that we want to study and that we want to treat. And we cannot forget this connection between public health and clinical medicine.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Having those kind of connections is what's going to really make a difference. Circling all the way back to part of that earlier conversation, right? And knowing what it is that people want when it comes to their own personal health, and making sure that we educate and connect with people across the board, public health, interventional health, actual treatment itself. Now, one of the things that's happened over the past 2 years is I think a lot of us, and myself included, have been distracted, focusing mainly on the coronavirus pandemic. But in preparing for this panel, I have realized that there has been actually much progress that's been made in heart failure in other areas over these past 2 years. So I do think that the conversation, the panel before ours, really did talk a little bit to this idea of how you have to have fortitude and you have to be committed long-term when it comes to developing treatments for heart failure. But it also does seem like there's some things on the horizon here. Specifically, really excited that Dr. Sputich is on this panel, right? Because two of the companies that he's been involved in co-founding actually are having products that are, nearing the market. We're getting some definitive results in patients using these products. Also, AstraZeneca is committed to it. Merck and Bayer are working in heart failure. So I'm wondering if each one of you can touch base, just walk us through what you're most excited about. Now, I will say that I'm a little bit concerned about the LVADs, the support systems, right? We don't have really great results for that. The pandemic itself has made it more difficult, I understand, for transplants. Perhaps Dr. Lewis could speak to that point, but if you will talk to these topics, what you're most excited about in terms of actually getting a product to the market for heart failure patients, and where we're going to be, say, in the next 5 or 10 years. And we will end on this topic. So if we'll just walk through each one of you, let us know what you think of where we are right now when it comes to heart failure. Let's start with Dr. Harrington.
Well, I'm going to defer to my heart failure expert friends here, and I'll give two broad topics that I'm most excited about. And it's interesting for an interventional cardiologist what I'm going to say. I'm most excited about prevention. I think the word is out that whether we're talking about coronary disease, heart failure, some of the neurocognitive disorders, stroke, prevention's the name of the game. And I think people get that, and we're going to need to focus on that. Secondly, I think that we are at the cusp of being able to do clinical research more and more efficiently, largely by employing data tools and technology. So prevention and improvement in the research process, that to me is going to help facilitate the care of patients with heart failure.
Dr. Lewis?
I like that as well. And I would say the things that I'm most excited about, I'll just mention a couple. I will echo the digital technology. The fact is that with wearables, digital technology, integrated systems where we can take all of this data and implement it into disease management and trying to get patients on guideline-directed medical therapy, I think is very exciting. The second actually is the wins. The wins. I never like to say a positive and negative trial. The only negative trial is a trial that wasn't done appropriately to test the hypothesis. But the fact is that we do have an expansion of therapies, and we have a lot of people who are actually doing novel research, taking the basic science and implementing it into phase 1, 2, and 3 studies to try to further push. That means that companies are not giving up, researchers are not giving up, and patients are not giving up. So that's exciting that these victories can actually motivate us. Because there was a time just 15 years ago when I was concerned that people would say, you know what, it's not worth it. It's too difficult to actually to solve this problem. Heart failure is so complex. So that's exciting for me. And the third is the fact that there's so much effort put on reducing the health inequities in heart failure.
Dr. Sputich,
Well,
pick your baby. Pick your baby. What are you excited about here?
Well, being a basic biochemist and biophysicist, I'm excited about the opportunities of thinking out of the box and approaching the whole problem in terms of therapeutics a new way. And that's, of course, exactly what we did 25 years ago when we started Cytokinetics, because all drugs were affecting upstream signaling events, changing calcium, as I mentioned before. And we started Cytokinetics with the realization that let's think about something that no one's really tried before. And the reason Cytokinetics got started, I'll tell you, is that I was serving on the SmithKline-Beecham Discovery Board 2 or 3 years before we started CK. And every time I went there and told them, why isn't anybody actually targeting the sarcomere directly? They said, we don't know much about that. After 2 years of telling them, they didn't invite me back. And then I approached, my colleagues, Ron Vale and Larry Goldstein, who, and I said, this is ridiculous that there isn't anyone approaching heart failure from the point of view of, and oncology as well, from the point of view of the cytoskeleton. And that's what led to the beginnings of Cytokinetics. And I just want to emphasize that it's still true that the whole Cytokinetics adventure, which I'm incredibly high on, because I think it's the right approach for a new innovative approach, is still very, very new. I mean, there was a second company, Myocardia, that was doing it too, but they no longer exist. And the big pharma companies are trying to take it up, but it really takes what Robert Blum was talking about early on, a group of people who you've collected together, who are have all the characteristics he talked about and that you asked about, but also people who really, really understand the fundamentals of how the heart really works. And that's what Cytokinetics represented and still represents. So I'm still very, very excited about the new adventures in new drug discovery with new ideas and innovative thinking out of the box ideas. And I think there's a lot more of that to come.
Great. And Dr. Malik, just going to change it up just a little bit on you, because we are talking about fortitudes on the frontiers here with this. You guys did get a little bit of negative news yesterday. Wondering if you can talk about how you're looking going forward with this news, but just having fortitude and getting across the finish line, bringing new products to patients. Where are you mentally when it comes to that process? And we're going to end on that note.
I think Eldrin said it earlier, which is a well-designed experiment that comes up with a clear answer, helps you move the field forward. And the news we got yesterday was not central to the progression of the therapy we were studying. We have other data that are more substantial, if you will, but it teaches us something about heart failure and where and exercise and heart failure and so forth. So, I view this as the field that we work in is very hard. Not everything will succeed, yet you have to enjoy the journey as much as the destination. And hopefully your destination, you have a few successes along the way. And frankly, we work in a very binary world where you either have a long research product that leads to a medicine that helps patients, or you don't. And you often don't get there till the end. So you have to focus on what you learn along the way as much as you do on how you get to the end as well.
Great. And, we are certainly, the world is thankful that there are companies and researchers and brilliant minds such as all of yours working in this area. Heart failure is definitely a devastating condition and something for which we do need more medicines. Hopefully, Godspeed to all of you that we will get there in the days, weeks, months, and years ahead. Thank you to everyone for being part of this panel. And thank you to all the listeners, people who are involved. We are excited to have you participate, listen with us, tweet to us, hashtag Fortitude on the Frontiers, and please stay tuned for innovation. As I think it was Dr. Lewis who said, he's very excited about what's coming in the years ahead. I am as well. Thank you so much.